Welcome to the Wisdom K podcast, your authentic mental health and self development podcast. Here, I share with you simple, sound, and well researched lessons that will help you to function at your optimum. I hope you will learn something new today. Hello, I welcome you once again to the Wisdom K podcast. I am your host, Wisdom K Kujoji. This is the third episode of our podcast, and I hope that you will learn from today's lesson. Today, our focus is on self-awareness, developing self-awareness, and we'll try to understand what self-awareness is, and we'll examine 3 keys to developing self-awareness. When we talk about self-awareness, why is it important for us to be self-aware? Self-awareness is a key component of what we call emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence refers to your ability as an individual to process emotions, process emotional information, and use this ability to process such information that is emotional, whether it is sadness, whether it is happiness, whatever form of emotions there are, your ability to process this information and use it in making decisions and taking certain actions. So, self-awareness is a key component of emotional intelligence. And for you to be able to also regulate your actions, be able to be in control of how things move, whether with yourself or others in different situations, self-awareness is very key. So although the term or the concept of self-awareness may seem basic, it is central to who we are and what we do, and that is why we want to look at self-awareness in today's episode. So what exactly is self-awareness? The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines it as self-focused attention or knowledge. So self-focused attention or knowledge. And this gives us an understanding that there is some attention that is paid to the self. And in our first episode of this podcast, we looked at self-concept and we defined the self as the totality of the individual, consisting of all their characteristics, whether conscious or unconscious. So when we talk about self-awareness, there's this attention that is paid to the self, and this attention is paid to the self with the goal of understanding the self and being able to regulate one's actions based on this knowledge of self. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary also defines self-awareness as an awareness of one's own personality or individuality. And we've established before that each person is unique. And so when we look at the self, we are looking at characteristics, physical characteristics, psychological characteristics, and various, traits that makes the individual unique. And so if we are aware of our own personality and how unique we are, then we can say that we are self-aware. And self-awareness is something that you can consciously build. And the balance in being aware of yourself, your individuality, your personality, having a self-focused knowledge is important, and it should be in a proper balance, because there could be a point where you are overly self-aware, which will lead to what we call self-consciousness, and that becomes unhealthy. So self-awareness, number 1, is self-focused attention or knowledge, according to the APA Dictionary of Psychology. And number 2, it is an awareness of one's own personality or individuality, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So 3 things stand out from our definition. Number 1 is that when we talk about self-awareness, it is an awareness of your thoughts and belief systems. So having a present awareness, recognition, knowledge of your thoughts and belief systems is important. So if you are self-aware, the first component we are talking about is that you have this present recognition of what you are thinking and what your belief systems are, what your value systems are. That is the first component we talk about when it comes to self-awareness. There are many individuals that do not really understand or know what informs their actions, what informs their choices. So you can't really have a grasp of why you do certain things. That means that you are not really self-aware. You don't really have a good grasp of what your thoughts are and how these thoughts inform your actions and your inactions. That means that you are not really self-aware. So the first component we are talking about is an awareness of your thoughts and your belief systems. The second component is an awareness of your emotions and how you experience or express them. And as I mentioned earlier, self-awareness is one of the key components of emotional intelligence. So your emotional quotient will be measured by how much you are aware of your personal emotions, how you are able to process your personal emotions and the emotions of others, and how you experience or express these emotions. If you are self-aware, you will know when you are getting angry. You will know it if there's a circumstance or an environment or something that is going on that seems to be triggering certain emotions in you. So you can process and interpret information that it relates to your emotions, and you really know how your emotions are experienced, so that if you are in an instant or in a situation where you are getting angry, you don't get to the point where you are angry and you cause damage before you later, regret what you did. You are able to process it once you begin to feel that sensation or that, bit of anger boiling up, and you take steps to ensure that it doesn't boil over. And the third component we'll talk about is an awareness of your actions and how they impact you as well as others. So how your actions impact you and others. So if you are in a work environment, are you aware of how your actions and inactions, what you do and what you don't do, impact yourself, impact your productivity, impact your relationship with others, as well as impact you yourself and your ability to perform at your maximum? If you are not aware of how your actions are influencing or affecting others, either positively or negatively, then it means that you have a low self-awareness. And if you are not able to have this present recognition of the self as it relates to you and others, then it will be difficult for you to regulate your actions, because you can't really even see or notice how these actions and inactions are affecting you and others. So these are three key dimensions of self-awareness that we want to look at. There was an American psychologist who came up with a test called the Mirror Self-Recognition Test, or the Mirror Test. It's also sometimes called the MAC test. And this American psychologist named Gordon Gallup Jr. Tried to assess in animals, particularly using monkeys and apes, to find out whether they are able to tell themselves from an image of them in a mirror. So whether they can recognize their own reflection in a mirror if the mirror is presented before them. Whole idea was that if the animals are able to recognize, for instance, that a mark that was put on their forehead, maybe it's a paint, a pen, whatever mark it is on their forehead, when they see themselves in the mirror, if they are able to put their hand on that mark and probably try to clean it off, then it means that they have developed self-awareness. Now, for the most part, the animals that were used, the monkeys and the apes that were used, initially they behaved weirdly when they saw themselves in the mirror. But after some days, after some time, they began to more or less look themselves in the mirror and perform certain actions that tell that, okay, they can now recognize that it is they themselves that are showing in the mirror. And the mirror test has been used with human beings, and it's been found that it is not yet until the age of about 2 years that children are able to develop self-recognition or self-awareness. Now, the mirror test has its own limitations and criticisms, but the major highlight is that we develop self-awareness in childhood, particularly around the age of 2 and above. And this is consistent with some theories of development, such as Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory. And in his theory, he mentions how at the early stage of development, between 0 to the age of 2 years, children do not yet understand that if an object is taken away or covered, it means that it does not mean that it does not exist again. So it is until they are hitting the age of 2 that they develop what is called the object permanence. So a baby will now be able to tell that if there's this object in front of me and they cover it, it does not mean that the object has suddenly vanished or is not present again. If I'm playing with a toy and the toy, the toy is pushed somewhere, it does not mean that it has ceased existing. It still exists. That is object permanence. So it is by the age of 2 that they are able to recognize this thing, that out of sight does not mean that it does not exist. And they are also able to control objects and act with intentionality. So when they are playing, by the age of 2, they are able to play more intentionally, do things more intentionally. And that is at the sensory motor stage of their development. And some of these key developmental milestones are achieved around the age of 1.5 to 2 years. So it makes sense that the development of self-awareness is developed by the age of 2. There are also experiments. There's one called the cat pulling experiment, where they found that until about the age of 1.5 and 2 years, children that were placed on a cart that had a doormat or a mat attached to it, they couldn't recognize that it's because they were standing on the mat. That is why the cart couldn't move. So they were supposed to push the cart towards their mom, but a mat was tied to the cart such that they were standing on the mat. So if you are moving the mat, until you recognize that it is because you are standing on it, that is why it is not moving, you will not be able to have the idea that I need to get off the mat or untie the mat from the cart itself. So that development of self-awareness, being aware that my action or inaction is what is causing the cart to move, it is those children that were around the age of 1.5 through to 2 years that were able to recognize that. And in another theory, Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, he talks about the age of 1.5 through to 3 years, around 3 years, where children develop what he calls the autonomy versus shame and doubt. And it is at this stage of autonomy that children begin to learn to operate independently. So they want to do things by themselves. They want to be independent. That quest for independence or autonomy begins to develop after the age of 1.5 through to 3. And what does this mean to us? It means that right from childhood, that bit of an ability to be self-aware, recognize our own actions, thoughts, emotions, and how they are distinct from others, as well as how they are also influencing what we are, what we do, and how things move around us, is there. And we can consciously build on that self-awareness to the point where it helps us in our daily lives. So what are some of the keys to self-awareness? As I mentioned, we'll look at three of them. Three keys to self-awareness. The first key is what we would call self-knowledge. Self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is important. It's an important thing for developing self-awareness and by extension self-regulation. And there are four key things that you can do in developing this self-knowledge or building upon your self-knowledge. And that self-knowledge, the first thing you want to do is to do an assessment of your strengths and abilities. And you want to take a pen and paper. You want to write down what your strengths are: intellectual strengths, social strengths, physical strengths and abilities, whatever form. You can list them under the various categories. So there are some physical abilities you have, maybe in sports you are strong, you are this. You want to write them down. Intellectual abilities, your ability to speak in public, engage in debates, whatever it is, very good at mathematics, in calculations. Whatever strengths and abilities you have, you want to list them. You may want to list them all together generally, or you may want to classify them: social strengths, intellectual strengths, physical strengths or abilities, and all. But you want to consciously list out your strengths and abilities. And in assessing them, what it means is that you are trying to, for instance, rank them from the highest to the lowest and find reasons why you are so strong in these particular areas, or you have these particular abilities, and what, for instance, you can do to maintain them or make them better. So that is the first thing under self-knowledge. Knowing your strengths and your abilities, writing them out, and thinking them through is very important. It helps you to know what you are able to do. And once you know what you are able to do, what your strengths, your positives are, it helps you to become more self-aware, to be able to reflect more on the self. Number two under self-knowledge is that you need to assess your weaknesses and your shortfalls. So if you are a student, what are your shortfalls? Which subjects am I not so strong in, and why am I not so strong in them? So you are just assessing your weaknesses. If there are some physical weaknesses, social weaknesses in terms of how you relate with people, you want to list all of them out. Your weaknesses and your shortfalls. And once again, you may want to list them generally, or you may want to classify them under your social skills weaknesses, your intellectual weaknesses, your physical weaknesses and shortfalls, and all that. The third thing you want to do is to do an assessment of your likes and dislikes. So your interests and things that do not interest you. The final thing you want to do under self-knowledge is an assessment of your goals and your objectives. So what are my objectives in life generally? And what are my objectives if I'm a student? What are my objectives or goals in friendships, in religious relations, in family building, at my workplace? What are my goals? What are my objectives? Listing these out and paying attention to them helps to increase your self-knowledge. And once self-knowledge is increased, you are on a good course to increasing or improving upon your self-awareness. The second key is self-reflection. So beyond self-knowledge, is self-reflection. So reflecting on all these things that you have even identified through your self-knowledge assessment is very key. A reflective life. And what you can do, number one, is to assess your thoughts and how they influence your emotions, for instance. So now you are reflecting on your thoughts, whether positive or negative, and how they influence your emotions. So you want to reflect on how you think, what you think about, and how these thoughts affect your emotions. So if you have a problem speaking in public, for instance, someone who is self-aware or is consciously building upon their self-awareness would take time to reflect on what was I thinking as I was standing in front of that crowd. These were people that I know, so why did I get anxious? So they are thinking through the thoughts they may have been having and how it affected their emotions while standing there in front of the people. That is a good place to reflect on. And you also want to reflect, number two, on how your emotions are and how these emotions influence your actions. So once I begin to feel uneasy, once I begin to feel disappointed, once I begin to feel happy, once I begin to feel sad, this is how it affects my actions. So sometimes when I feel elated, when I feel happy, I end up taking decisions that don't help me because I don't really think through the steps or actions I take. I am over the moon, so I just take actions that later I regret. So being able to reflect on how your emotions also influence your actions is an important component of developing a better self-awareness. Number three, you also want to assess how your actions influence yourself and others. So an assessment of the key steps you take, your actions, how you talk to people, what you do, how you relate with people, and all those things. The actions that you take in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, by close of day, reflecting on the actions you took, leaving to work at a particular time, talking to somebody at a particular time, using a particular route, reflecting on all these things and how it affected your day, how it affected your week, and how it affected your relationship with others is also very critical. Assessing your actions. And so you would find that self-reflection goes beyond just self-knowledge. You are going beyond knowing what you think, knowing about your emotions, your likes, your dislikes, and all that, into reflecting on how these things affect you and affect others and influence who you are and how you live. You also want to assess other people that you relate with. So your friends, your siblings, your colleagues, an assessment of others you relate with and how their own beliefs, how their own emotions and their own actions influence you. That is where observation comes in, observational learning, being observant, so that you can really tell that in the workplace, I'm able to thrive when these particular people are at work, when these particular people are not at work, or something. You are very observant. When this person talks to me this way, it really gets me frustrated. You are observant. You assess other people you are relating with on various fronts and how their own belief systems, their emotions, and their actions influence you. So if you are able to assess other people, evaluate their actions, their beliefs, their emotions, and how it influences you, and reflect on these, it helps you to become more self-aware, so that in company of these people, as you work with them, as you relate with them, you will also know how to regulate your own behaviors, which is a key thing about self-regulation. And you also want to have an assessment of when you operate at your best and at your worst. This reflection is very key to improving your level of self-awareness. And you can do this by journaling. And whether it is the self-knowledge or the self-reflection bit, you can have a journal where you write all of these things that we have mentioned in there. Your assessment of self, you can have a journal where you do it in as your tool for reflection or your tool for gathering self-knowledge. So beyond the first two we have talked about, the self-knowledge and self-reflection, one final thing that can help you in developing a better self-awareness is to be open to feedback. Feedback is very important. So in communication, we say that until feedback is given, communication is not complete. So if you are an individual who wants to operate at your best, you want to be able to accept feedback, whether positive or negative. And if you are open to feedback, it helps you to see things about yourself, what you do, how you regulate your emotions, for instance, how you talk and all that you yourself cannot see, but others can see. Sometimes what you personally see is not all that there is. And it takes other people in the background to be able to see what you cannot see and be able to help with that feedback. So consciously you want to ask for feedback. Ask a friend, ask a colleague. So how do you think I performed on this particular task today? I've been trying to improve on how I talk in public, my public speaking abilities. What do you think, I've been able to improve on so far? You've known me for the last 3 years. What do you think has changed about me? And what do you think I can still work on? Feedback is an essential tool for your everyday living and success. And you can consciously look out for feedback from people. Positive and negative feedback, very important. People will tell you things about yourself that you feel is fine, it's okay. But once they tell you and they mention to you that it affects them and how they relate with you, it helps you to be able to make the necessary adjustments that can, make life easier for you when you relate with them. So positive and negative feedback are necessary for change and for growth. And whenever you avoid feedback, especially constructive feedback from others, your superiors, your colleagues, you deny yourself of the opportunity to grow. And one of my bosses will tell you that feedback is really important if you want to be a successful clinician, a successful psychologist, because what you do in therapy, when you are able to share it with your colleagues and they tell you what they think, they give you some feedback on what they think you were missing out, and they also ask you whether you found out this and that, it helps you to know what you missed and what you can do better in your next session. So whether it is intentional or it is others giving you feedback without you necessarily asking, it is important that you listen to what others have to say about you, your personality, your work output, and all others. Some of them may be very negative. We have this natural tendency to fight anything that threatens us. And so feedback that is negative can sometimes, be difficult to take, but it is also needed. You can't always have your positives spelled out. You also need some negatives in order to help you to live a more balanced life. So this brings us to the end of today's session, where we have discussed self-awareness, the components that you need to pay attention to, and how you can improve or develop your self-awareness using 3 key steps or approaches. I hope you have learned something new today, and I hope to see you in the next episode of this podcast. Until then, stay safe and always be a blessing. Bye-bye.